I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, Ukrainian soldiers have been warmly welcomed to Kherson city amid jubilant scenes marking the end of more than 8 months of Russian occupation. Pictures of Ukrainian flags being raised in the centre of the city are posted on social media just a month after Vladimir Putin claimed sovereignty over the entire Kherson region in southern Ukraine. The Kremlin insisted Kherson was still part of Russia after announcing it had withdrawn all of its troops and equipment from the city in the early hours of Friday. We discuss the news from Kherson and around Ukraine, and we also talk to author and historian Owen Matthews to hear his views on the origins of the conflict, the shifting politics inside the Kremlin, and possibilities for the near future after what looks like another astonishing Ukrainian victory.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 11th of November, day 261. And today, I'm joined by our senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, our assistant comment editor Francis Durnley, and our guest, Owen Matthews. I started by asking Roland for the latest news from Kherson.
Quite remarkable stuff, to be absolutely honest with you. So, to set the scene very, very briefly, Wednesday afternoon, Sergei Shoigu and Sergei Surovkin, the top military people in Russia, announced we are going to withdraw from Kherson. We all thought, okay, that's a big operation. That's going to take a week to put together. Late last night, Alexei Reznikov, the Ukrainian foreign minister, said, I think it's going to take the Russians minimum a week to do this. Well, 5 a.m. this morning, they blew up the bridges and said, that's it, we're done, everybody's out. So it seems that there was a remarkably chaotic night on the banks of the Dnipro River. A lot of fog of war. I've got to caveat this. A lot of this is Telegram chat from Russian soldiers, from Russian bloggers, from pro-Ukrainian sources. Very difficult to verify. But it looks like there was a big mad dash to get as many Russians out as possible overnight, partly on the bridges, a lot of them using pontoons, ferries, any kind of boat that's available. And then early this morning, about 5 a.m.-ish, the Russian High Command said, right, that's it. Blew the bridges, and it's over. The Battle of Kherson is officially, I suppose you could say, over. The Ukrainians are advancing rapidly. We've just seen geolocated photographs. The latest one I've seen is of a Ukrainian soldier outside a particular pub, so we know where it is, in a kind of western district of Kherson city. So, he's about probably half an hour's walk from the city centre. There are already Ukrainian flags up in Kherson city centre. It is, we could say officially it's over. This is the end of the Battle of Kherson that has been running for months and months. The Ukrainians have won. It's not the real end, though, because despite the Russian Ministry of Defense saying not a single man has been left behind, every other independent source seems to disagree with that. Not least, there was a particularly agitated Russian soldier on his personal Telegram channel last night who said the last order we got was put on civilian clothes and it's every man for himself. He was extremely angry, really mouthing off against the High Command. There's pro-Ukrainian sources saying that that most of the Russians got across, but maybe up to 4,000 Russians still in the city. No one really knows. And that is probably only going to become clear in the next few days. And I will refer listeners once again to the Ukrainians' frustratingly efficient information security policy. Journalists will not be in there, I would guess, going on past experience for at least a few days. So it's going to be difficult for us to get our own eyes on the ground telling you exactly what's happened. But that's to where we are. So in brief, a very rapid Russian withdrawal, looking like a collapse. The very rapid end of one of the most hard-fought battles. We're talking weeks and weeks and months of this war. And, well, I'll leave it for you to decide the significance of that. But those are the facts this morning and where we are at this moment.
Thanks very much, Roland. Francis, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I would echo everything that Roland has just said, and good afternoon, everyone, I should say. I think this is a really significant moment for the reasons that Roland's just highlighted, but also, as we spoke about at length yesterday on the podcast, the symbolic significance of this we knew would be very important, and we're now really starting to see that visually in a way that really resonates with a lot of people. We didn't have that when we were talking at this time yesterday, but now, as Roland was saying, we're seeing very striking imagery of flags being put up at central civic buildings in Kherson, of triumphant Ukrainian soldiers marching through key parts of it. So I think that as the day wears on, and indeed the weekend, I think we can expect the symbolic resonance of Kherson and the sense of this being a defeat for the Russians, whether completely accurately or not, to be more strongly defined in the narrative of this war. That some of the questions that we were raising yesterday will, I think, dissipate somewhat as people recognise the symbolic significance of this. So, as Roland was saying, a very, very important moment, it feels.
Roland, can I come very quickly back to you? Do you get a sense, have you seen anything yet of how Russian media has reacted to this? What's the feeling in Russia about what's happened?
Look, I'm not in Russia, so I can't tell you what the man in the street is saying. And B, frankly, no, I haven't actually been trawling through the pages of Komsomolskaya Pravda and Channel One this morning. I've been trying to keep up with the very rapid developments as they happen. So I would hesitate. I would hesitate to try and give our listeners a definitive account of Russian emotions over this, but I would say it's safe to say that it's never nice to see your army in retreat. I think that is a reasonable assumption.
Thanks, Roland. Francis, can I come back to you? I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the implications for this victory on negotiations, and there's been some interesting things to discuss around that coming out of Ukraine.
Yes, thank you, David. I spoke yesterday at length about the fissure, as it were, that's developing between perhaps the Ukrainian stance on this idea of peace and perhaps some of Ukraine's Western partners. I spoke at length yesterday about the remarks of Mark Milley, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Defence in the US, about this idea of perhaps this being a good moment to take stock and to think about some sort of negotiated peace. As I expected then, and talked about, there is a real gulf here between the Ukrainian side and some others on this view of whether negotiations are the way forward or not. Ukraine thinks it is winning this war, and that the end game is Putin to be overthrown and for some kind of peace deal to be settled once they have not only removed them from past the pre-February 24th borders, but indeed actually removing them from Crimea as well. So that is obviously not the view that is shared perhaps in amongst some partners in Europe who feel that, the sooner this war ends, the better. So there are tensions in play. And just speaking to this, since the podcast yesterday, the Ukraine's top prosecutor has said that resuming negotiations with Russia is not impossible, but he's looking to establish a special international tribunal to hold Russia accountable since the war began. And he goes on and talks about the scale of the suffering. And again, I just wanted to underline this point because it's been a very consistent line of the Ukrainians since the beginning that war crimes have been committed in their country. The terrible scenes in Bucha are scenes not seen in Europe for a very substantial period indeed, truly horrific. And they don't just want this to be seen as another war. They want this to be seen as a fundamental war crime that sees Putin sent to The Hague. And so it's very difficult to see a way in which that view can be reconciled with one that still sees Putin in power and for there to be some negotiated peace. Now, some people will argue that that's actually not for the Ukrainians to decide because they will say, well, this is entirely dependent on Western support. But I don't think that strength of feeling is really being truly appreciated by some Western commentators. So I just wanted to draw attention to that. But in the background to this, as I spoke about the US yesterday, there's still this discussion about the US in back channels urging Ukraine to use this window of opportunity for peace talks. And that is, of course, in the context of the G20, which, as I said yesterday, whilst Putin will not be attending in person, the expectation is that he will be attending virtually. And some people see this as a sign that the international community is willing to open up more lines of communication, shall we say, with Moscow and other European capitals. Now, as I say, that is disputed, but that is how some are interpreting this. So in the political space, this is a really significant moment. I know I say that all the time, but this feels like a very significant moment. And the Kherson significance is that it changes the tone of the discussion. If you imagine how things would be at this moment if Kherson was looking like a defeat for Ukraine, I think that the discussions of negotiations would be far, far stronger than they have been. But indeed, that argument, I think, is being quite consistently undermined, at least in the information war, as a consequence of this Ukrainian victory. So, as I say, complicated picture, but a significant one.
Well, thank you, Francis. Roland, do you have anything you'd like to add, or shall we move to our guest, Owen Matthews?
No, I think that more or less covers it. We do have a front page on the theme of these this quote unquote window of opportunity that the Americans seem to be pushing on the Ukrainians, and I think Francis has more or less summed up what I think is the big perception gap. The basic big perception gap is Western officials thinking, look, at some point we're going to have to sit down with Putin and we're going to have to talk to him. That's just the way the world is. We got to live with it. And there is a very strong feeling in Kiev that you don't understand this Russian regime. They're not interested in talking, really. And they're not interested in our red lines, and they have to be defeated on the battlefield. And secondly, you don't understand, and we understand, by the way, because we are Ukrainians and we're here and we know Russia and Russians. We understand how fragile that regime is. And actually a defeat, the continuation of all these defeats on the battlefield after Kharkiv and Kiev and now Kherson, that is going to be felt back in Russia, and actually the world will be a much safer place once that regime has crumbled. But with that, yes, I think we should move on to our guest. Absolutely.
Just very quickly, Francis, I know you want to come in on that, and then we'll go to Owen.
Forgive me, just very, very briefly, I think Roland's absolutely right on this central tension. And indeed, just one thing I think that's worth saying is that on this perception gap, there seems to be, I think, a belief in the West that actually now Russia have sustained their economy, fortified their economy enough that they would be able to continue this war for months, years, and in such a manner that, in a sense, things will be consistently as they are. And I think it's important that we do challenge that view. As we talked about in the past, there was that very influential and persuasive Yale paper that talked about just how fractured the Russian economy has become as a consequence of what has occurred since the invasion in Ukraine. And I think there's no reason to think that if this war, God forbid, were to last another 6 months or a year or even longer, that really the status quo as we understand it now would be the same. Think how much has changed in the last 6 or 7 months from when the war began. There's no reason, I don't think, to think that things are going to be consistently the same. But it seems that there are some Western leaders who think that as things are now in terms of the strength of the Russian regime and the strength of the Ukrainian regime is going to remain consistent. I don't think that's the case. And I think so this whole argument, I think, is built on something of a false premise. But anyway, let's definitely go to our guest.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Roland. So, Owen, thank you so much for coming in. You're a journalist, writer, historian. Can you tell us just a little bit about your background, your career, before we get on with the questions?
Well, hi, thank you for having me on. I've been a foreign correspondent for Newsweek magazine for 25 years. I was Moscow bureau chief for a large part of that period, and I've been traveling to Russia since, and I was at the Moscow Times before that. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that have been said. I don't disagree on anything that Francis and Roland have said, except that I would actually suggest we turn it on its head and see this thing from Moscow. And we're talking about a perception gap. And as Roland rightly said, things will not really change. Putin will not have a strong incentive to sue for peace until he's defeated in the battlefield. But actually, from the Russian perspective and from the Russian media point of view, this is not a battlefield defeat. It's obviously not a victory, it's obviously not a success, but it's certainly being spun as an orderly retreat. So in fact, the Kremlin line is that actually they've deprived Kiev of a victory. They have reorganized their forces, they've withdrawn from an untenable position, they've reinforced their positions on the right bank of the Dnieper, making it more difficult for Ukraine to push through the rest of Kherson Oblast and towards Zaporozhye. So actually, I don't think that in the eyes of the Russian people, or the eyes of, certainly not in the eyes of the Kremlin media, they actually have suffered a decisive setback. I mean, it's going to be spun. And really importantly, one of the real bellwethers about all of this war has been the reaction of pro-Kremlin nationalists who have been very strictly and we've been very surprisingly and very strongly critical of Sergei Shoigu and the conduct of the war. And it's really quite telling that these people have actually, been praising, a lot of the Telegram channels have actually been praising and saying, like, it's very important to, the head of Wagner Group, Prigozhin, has actually been saying, like, it's very important to save the precious lives of our soldiers and regroup. So actually, while it's completely true to say that the Russians have suffered a serious defeat, it's not the disaster that's actually going to force Putin to sue for peace. I think the much more telling thing is that actually, recent polls, and there's a whole, one has to take polls in any authoritarian society with a major pinch of salt, but actually there are strong indications that support for the war is slipping. It's slipping, I think, because the people have starting to tire of it, not because anything disastrous is happening. And I was in Moscow until I spent most of this war in Moscow, part of it in Kiev, but mostly in Moscow. And I left in the middle of October for a month ago. And the really striking thing was the basic invisibility of the war in Moscow and the invisibility of sanctions. So France has referred to that Yale study about the economic collapse of Russia. It's very true. This war and sanctions have robbed Russia of its future. They've absolutely poisoned Russia's economy in the root. All that is true, but we're actually talking about an 8% predicted fall in GDP. It may actually be less. So that's compared to the scale of disasters that Russians have seen in their lifetimes. The average middle-aged Russian has lived through at least sort of 5 cataclysmic economic collapses. So there's not actually a very strong, as yet, sort of economic disaster unfolding that would actually make Russians believe that they actually need to urgently change their regime. For better or worse. And the final thing I'd like to pick up on from what Francis and Roland were saying was that the world would be a safer place once the Putin regime crumbles, says Roland, and I think
say Ukrainian officials who I was quoting. Owen.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. No. Well, that's exactly what I was going to say, is that that's exactly what the Ukrainians think. But I think that that's certainly not what, for instance, the French think. And I think there's a rather large section of the American security establishment that also views that as a really terrifying outcome. And crucially, one of the things that I reveal in my book, Overreach, which just come out this week, is that actually right from the beginning of the war, there's been quite a strong back-channel contact between Beijing and Washington concerning the war. And the unspoken understanding has been that China has held back from economic and military support of Moscow on the premise that NATO does not get involved in the war on the ground in Ukraine. And that's really a very, and as if we're talking about regime change in Moscow, I think that's a red line, not just because we're talking about a potentially unstable situation, but that's a very abstract concept, and we don't really know exactly what's going to happen in a post-Putin world. But certainly the Chinese are going to be incredibly unhappy about regime change in Moscow. And most crucially, I think the fear is, certainly in the Elysee Palace, and Macron has been saying since May, very controversially, everyone's come down on him like a ton of bricks for this, for his cynicism. But Macron was saying as early as May, Putin must not be humiliated. But what does that mean? It doesn't mean that Macron likes Putin. He just is fearful, and his security people are telling him that a post-Putin regime may actually be more nationalistic and more aggressive than Putin himself, which seems inconceivable. But actually, in this, I'm a historian, so I'm a little bit wary of historical analogies. But what if Putin is not Hitler? He's Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Kaiser of Germany, who got his country into a disastrous First World War which they couldn't win. And that's followed by humiliating defeat. And then you have something much worse coming along. And that's certainly what the French fear and certain sections of the American political establishment fear. So indeed, there's a major perception gap between the Ukrainians and a lot of the West over the endgame of this war and how desirable it is for a Ukrainian military victory in the field, and how desirable regime change in Russia might be, and how dangerous, in fact, for Europe and for Ukraine itself.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Owen. I was struck by what you said about how the perception difference of the victory in Kherson. And I mean, would you say that the Ukrainians see it as almost like their D-Day, whereas the Russians are trying to see it as their Dunkirk, that they've retreated, but they're not out. They'll come back. Is that fair? Is that? I know you said you don't like historical analogies, but is that a fair one?
No, that's pretty much on the money. No, I agree. That's one of the most striking things about the war on the Ukrainian side, because I've been in Moscow more recently than I was in Kiev, but I mean, certainly the polls show that an astounding number of Ukrainians, I think the latest one I saw in late September was 93% of Ukrainians are convinced that they will be able to throw Russians out of every square centimeter of their country. And that's what they're being told by Vladimir Zelensky. I personally think that that's deeply unrealistic. And actually, we're heading for a major train wreck when that illusion collides with reality. And at some point, there's going to have to be negotiations on the ground, because there's a gigantic groundswell of very strong opinion that we must kick Russians completely out of our territory. And I wonder whether that's actually going to be militarily possible. And just looping back to Kherson, I mean, just the logistics. I went back to the lower Dnieper a few years ago. I mean, it's a really wide river. I mean, it's 2 kilometers wide. It's like massively wide and very difficult to cross. I mean, the Novokakhovka Dam is still standing. I'm not sure that there's a catastrophist predictions that the entire area will be flooded, because in fact the step of the dam is actually only 4.5 meters. It's not like 40 meters. It's not a gigantic body of water behind that dam. It's quite a low dam. But the point is that actually the idea of crossing that river, you said they see it as their D-Day. It'll be their D-Day if they actually cross the water and take the east bank of the river. But that's militarily, and I'm not a soldier, but I'm a military analyst, but I mean, that's clearly going to be an amazingly difficult challenge, especially if the Russians have retreated, as they seem to have, in relatively good order, at least without massive losses from Kherson, and actually redeployed on the east bank of the Dnieper. So the Ukrainians have a massive military challenge ahead of them to push further than Kherson.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating. There's so many questions. Can you take us? Can we leave what's happening in Kherson and today's news behind for a second? You've written a little bit about the period of time during the COVID pandemic, when we know that the famous germaphobe Vladimir Putin was largely isolated from his elite, and his emergence from that separation seemed to I don't know how to put it exactly, but coincide with his new sort of historical political vision for what he wanted Russia to be and what he wanted Russia to do. Can you tell us what you think happened in that infamous COVID bubble?
Well, it's very clear that actually this war was launched by Putin for the same reason that every autocrat ever launches a war, because they thought they could win it, because they underestimated the enemy and they overestimated their own capabilities. There was also a sort of undercurrent of imperial and historical thinking that Putin developed while he was at lockdown. But the basic bottom line of the whole build up to the war is groupthink. And the decisions of an autocrat and a very small number of people around him who believed what they were being told by their own security apparatus. And what they were being told was that the Ukrainians would meet them with open arms, that the Zelensky government would be easily toppled, that they were massively bribing everybody in sight and handing out millions of dollars to various corrupt Ukrainian officials and the security establishments and the government. And in fact, over 700 of them have been prosecuted since by the Ukrainian authorities for taking Russian money. So Putin actually had rather, in his own mind, rather good reason to believe that he could succeed, because he thought that, like any human being, the future would be like the past. And actually, in 2014, I was there. I'm sure Roland was there as well. There were actually massive pro-Russian demonstrations in the Dnipropetrovsk, in Kharkiv, in Odessa. There was a very strong anti-Maidan, anti-Ukrainian nationalist feeling in the east of Ukraine, and quite strong pro-Russian feeling. The problem for Putin was, this time it really was different. When they actually went in, they discovered that the Ukrainians were not welcoming them with open arms, that Zelensky didn't flee, and so on. But just to answer your question about COVID, the point is that the story of the Kremlin administration is, in a nutshell, that Putin had been surrounded by people clever people who often disagreed with him. They had different agendas. There were different sort of projects over his 20 years in power. Sort of nanotechnology and sort of world conservatism. There were various sort of things that the hobby horses that the Kremlin rode. But the common view, the common theme of all of these projects was that they were they were pursued by people who had an essentially sort of postmodern, quite consumerist attitude to ideology. And there was, we'll take a little bit of Soviet nationalism here, and we'll have a bit of Russian orthodoxy here, and we'll sort of put it all together and sort of bamboozle the people. And that was the story of Vladisław Surkov, who was a great Kremlin ideologue until the beginning of 2020. So it was essentially a cynical project run by people who'd been brought up in the 1990s Moscow in the media world. And those people that were pushed out, and the only people that were left in the room around Putin, they had always been there, by the way, like the barman in The Shining. They were always there. The scary securocrats that had worked with Putin since the 1970s, people like Alexander Bortnikov, the current head of the FSB, Nikolai Patrushev, former head of the FSB, and Putin himself, also a former head of the FSB, by the way. So the COVID just exacerbated that groupthink and just sort of sealed it in a bottle. So Putin found himself surrounded by a very small number of advisors, and particularly there was a billionaire called Yuri Kovalchuk, who is also known since the 1990s, who himself, as we know from people around him, is personally extremely interested in mystical nationalism and Orthodox destiny of Russia and all of this stuff. So Putin, in that sort of COVID bubble, found himself more isolated even than he had been before. And those sort of cynical pragmatists that had surrounded him before and actually maybe sort of given him different steers and actually reminded him that all of Russia's greatness that he talks about in his rambling historical essay, all of that greatness has been predicated on Russia's economic engagement with the West. Those people were no longer in the room, literally, physically. And that's the story of the COVID isolation. He came out believing his own, he'd drunk the Kool-Aid. He'd finally sort of bought into this vision that had formerly been peddled as a sort of postmodern sort of potpourri of rhetoric. But Putin actually really came to believe it.
Very quickly, Francis Sternley, I know you want to come back on some of this and maybe ask a question.
Yes, so it's really interesting hearing Owen's perspective on this. My question actually is a slightly different one, and it's one of the future of Russia. Really, we spoke yesterday about on this podcast about the planting of Russian fascism in the country now, and one that will almost certainly outlast Putin, given how he's imprinted this in schools and universities and everything else. I just want to ask a very simple question, which is, do you think that there's often a view that's been articulated by some that it's impossible for liberalism to ever be planted in Russia, that it is impossible due to its culture, due to the fact that it wants to be governed from the top, all of this kind of stuff? I just want to ask what your perspective on that is, as somebody who has lived in Moscow for that length of time, lived among the Russians. What's your take on Russia's future and whether it is possible for a more liberal democratic Moscow to ever emerge?
Well, that's a brilliant question, Francis, because actually the truth is, and what people tend to overlook, is that Putin is actually, along with Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Viktor Orban, actually an enormously successful populist. He's runs an authoritarian regime, but actually the key to his success is the Kremlin's absolute obsession with opinion polling. It sounds paradoxical that someone who's eliminated any kind of political opposition or free press would actually pay so much attention, but in fact, it's very important to the Kremlin, and it has always been very important to the Kremlin to actually study what the Russian people think. And the really one of the really telling things that I write about in my book, for instance, when you go back to like pre-Putin, is in the fall of that's 25 years of working for the Americans for you. In the autumn of 1999, before Putin came to power, there was a poll that asked Russians, 1999, pre-Putin, what are the things you want most? And the number one thing was to end the economic crisis that was then engulfing Russia. And the second one was to restore the greatness of the Soviet Union. 1999. So that's one of the things that's so scary and really important to bear in mind, is that you take away Putin, but actually Putin, the secret of his power is to tap into like a very deep rooted sense of grievance, of national humiliation. There's actually the 90s scarred Russia, as everyone who's ever worked in Russia sees very clearly, or even sat down with us for a conversation with a Russian who've lived through that period. Like that scar is really deep, and even the telling thing is that even sort of international, smart, clever Russians, who are our personal friends, and will actually find themselves, you probe and you realize that actually at a certain level, they're actually even quite liberal Russians are pleased that their country is no longer humiliated and it's respected. It's really extraordinary how deeply held that is. So to your question about liberalism, if it had not been for Putin, Russia could have had a very different future. That's definitely true. So what he did was he took all those very dark instincts, the dark instincts of people that made Vladimir Zhirinovsky, ultra-nationalist politician, came number one first in parliamentary elections in 1993. That sort of dark strain of ultra-nationalism, and he took it and he made it the philosophy of the government, and crushed liberalism. So the real problem is that when we talk about post-Putin Russia, and when we actually talk about the Russian opposition, we like to think of someone like Alexei Navalny, poisoned, imprisoned opposition leader. He is liberal, he's pro-Western, as the quote-unquote leader of the Russian opposition. But actually, the sad truth is that even when Navalny himself last ran for office, it was 2011 or thereabouts, the local municipal elections in Moscow, Navalny, the leader of the liberal opposition, got, the votes was rigged against him and so on and so on, but nonetheless, he got less than 20% of the votes in Moscow, the most liberal city in Russia. So the simple answer to your question, Francis, is that unfortunately, I don't really see liberalism as a serious political force in Russia, not only because it's been so systematically repressed under the 20 years of the Putin regime, but also because the Russian people actually need to be, bizarrely enough, sort of deconditioned. In fact, you might even use the word sort of denazified, which is, of course, Putin's what Putin's stated objective in Ukraine. But it's really Russia that needs to be deprogrammed, much more than Ukraine.
That's really interesting hearing your take on this. My next question, therefore, is how should the West, how should those who are more liberal-leaning in Russia, and of course there are some that we see, those who ran Memorial, for instance, those who have been imprisoned for fighting, against Putin. How do we strategically need to think about planting a process of denazification and making people wake up to an alternative? What is that strategic approach that needs to be adopted, do you think?
Well, if if you look back to what happened in the 80s, Soviet Union loses 15,000 men in Afghanistan in a disastrous war that they start to lose right from the get-go. They start to lose right from basically 1 year in. They get their backsides kicked by the Afghan Mujahideen, and that gets worse and worse. And it's not a problem for the Soviet regime until suddenly it is a problem. And what changes? What changes is you have glasnost. Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in 1985. Suddenly, 86, people start to write about the terrible the losses in the Soviet Union's pointless campaign in Afghanistan. So actually, the simple answer is glasnost. You actually have a media space that actually allows those sort of discussions to happen, and that's precisely why. And the Kremlin knows that very well, and that's precisely why they've been so hysterically and so brutally effective in actually suppressing any kind of international media or in any kind of pluralism in public debate. But there is hope. I don't want to be a total Cassandra. The really crucial thing is that the fate of Russia historically, I mean, going back to 1905, 1917, 1991, has been decided by the big cities, by Moscow and St. Petersburg. And there exists in those places a very large number of people who, not just private businessmen or entrepreneurs, but actually people who are connected with the government, who I've spoken to. And in the 7 months of the war, I did not really meet anyone who was properly, who was really wealthy, intelligent, well-traveled, that thought that this was a good idea. Some people were resigned. Some people were, passively in favor. Some people were passively against. But the key word, passively. But nonetheless, you do have like a major middle class who are basically rational Western, rational sort of European people who would be happy to live under a different Russia, which allowed them to travel, to make money, all those things that this war has robbed them of. But do they care enough to overthrow the regime? No, they don't, because although so many of them, I mean, up to around 500,000, it's hard to tell, but some of them have actually up sticks and left and gone into exile. Most people can't afford to do that. So they're just sort of apathetic and cynical, but nonetheless would probably, if they were offered, an abstract choice, would you like to have a more liberal Russia, which was open and not ultra nationalist, and did business freely with the West? They would say yes. The problem is that we're very far from a situation where they are actually willing to put risk their lives and freedom and livelihoods to achieve that result. But if it was presented to them as a free choice, then they would probably make it. So that's the somewhat hopeful part of it. I mean, Russia is they're not all sort of fascistic troglodytes. They're actually smart, rational people. But the point is that they make a cost-benefit analysis. They're patriots of their own capital, as a Moscow oligarch told me.
Well, thank you very much, Owen and Francis. Roland, would you like to come in on this? What questions do you have?
I've got lots of questions, Owen. But I've been writing some of them down. Your last point kind of links back to what you were saying when you began, and I had to correct you and say I'm quoting Ukrainian officials. I'm not myself saying that definitely, we need to see a collapse of the regime in Russia. But I mean, look, I was having this long conversation with Mikhailo Podolyak, this advisor to Zelensky in Kiev, and the way he put it was this: look, the thing you have to understand about Russia is that the real headbangers, right, the Igor Strelkovs, the Patrushevs, the kind of messianic Russia is different, let's go to war and restore the great Russian world that got us into this which became the bubble you're talking about, the Putin phone. He said, most Russians don't have a stake in that, right? They don't have a stake in that. They're not really interested in that. And that was why he was saying he thought there is a chance that this war will eventually end with regime. I mean, because you were at first kind of saying that it's impossible. Do you see that point? Do you think that this view in Kiev that actually the mess that these nationalists have got Russia into is eventually going to become too much for this passive mass to become unpassive, or do you think that the passivity is just so difficult to overcome when you basically have to make the decision to stick your neck out, right? You have to make a big a big choice about, I'm going to be ready to go to prison, get my head cracked, and you're jeopardizing not only yourself, but your family, your workplace, your students, if you're a professor or something. Do you think there is a chance that the great passive mass that you were talking about will, if not revolt, maybe more technocratically impose a palace coup d'etat or something like that?
That's also an excellent question, because I mean we're talking about two slightly different things. We're talking about what people might desire and what is achievable.
Exactly.
So the answer to that question is is stakes. Like what is at stake and for whom? So for people who are like in the middle class, like sort of most of the people that you and I know in Moscow, what's at stake is their future prosperity, and are they going to be able to go on a holiday in Italy, and like are their children going to have like a normal future and that kind of thing. What's at stake for the people at the top of the Kremlin is much more. In fact, it's their business empires, it's everything, it's their lives. So unfortunately, the problem is the people with the guns and the power and the money are very willing to fight for it, and that's so it's really a question of there's this sort of tension between what people actually want in the capitals and what they're willing to fight for, because the people at the top of the Kremlin really are willing to fight. And there's also a really important distinction to be made, is that there's actually sort of a strong ultranationalist potential threat from outside the Kremlin and also from inside the Kremlin as well to Putin's power. So if you're talking about actual regime change, there's the people in the Kremlin, as I said earlier, they're not stupid. They're extremely sensitive to polls. So if they see that this is going wrong, and the minute that there's a critical mass of people inside the top of the Kremlin that actually see that their position that might be strengthened by replacing Putin with some sort of non-Putin, then that will happen, because they will do it before it's done to them, for sure, to preempt. The last thing they want is like an ultranationalist revolution done by the headbangers. Although, by the way, there was a revolution executed by a very small number of headbangers in October 1917. Unfortunately, there is precedent for that. For armed and extremely motivated, tiny groups of people to take over states. That's literally happening.
Well, exactly, and you can see people like that kind of talking about that kind of thing, right?
And they're literally speaking about it openly. I mean, still Corfu has said there may come a moment when we'll have to seize power in Russia. I mean, it's terrifying. Yeah. So the Kremlin is very cognizant. They definitely don't want that to happen. But the really key thing is that, paradoxically, actually, the Kremlin, I think, is on one level, somewhat more pragmatic than Putin's ideological sort of screed of July of 2021 might suggest, because I think that what is important to the people around Putin. I mean, Putin is already 70 years old. He's on the clock. He's already 3 years older than the average.
Yeah, he doesn't smoke. He doesn't drink. He's a little guy. He's not like a big guy. Little dogs live longer. I mean, all of this.
That's true, but nonetheless, the lame duck Putin is not a million miles away. It could be like 3 years, 5 years, whatever. But the point is that's very much on the Kremlin's minds, and in fact they've been discussing it since 2019. It's sort of been a kind of a subject and controversial, obviously extremely controversial subject. Like, how will the Putin elite preserve their power beyond Putin itself? And so in that sense, actually, what's more important to them is not actually who replaces Putin, but like who gets to replace Putin. Like, whose interests are they acting in? And in terms of the war, I mean, I think clearly, anyone who's somewhat rational, I think, going up to sort of mid to high levels of the Kremlin realize that this could be a complete train wreck. It's a disaster. And they need to somehow get out of it. But what's a little bit concerning is that actually Putin could have, rather like Yasser Arafat, he's not lost an opportunity to lose an opportunity. He could have declared victory at the end of the first week of the war. He really could have. He could have declared victory as soon as they took the Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. There's lots of moments when he could have just stepped off this carousel and said, my work here is done. Thank you. Goodbye. And, that would have put enormous pressure, by the way, on Ukraine's Western backers if he'd sued for peace.
And this thing about Putin's rationality and his suddenly discovered this ability to screw up everything, right? And I want to I don't want to ambush you or anything, but my next question is, could you tell me why you were so catastrophically wrong about the war? I mean, and I am singling you out because you're here and you've just written a book. But it's important to say you're not alone. I think a lot of us who were steeped in Russia and steeped in Moscow and spent our whole professional lives kind of thinking about what the Kremlin's going to do in opinion polls and Alexei Navalny and what's going to happen in 2024 and the succession question and all of this kind of lived and breathed Russia and Russian politics for years. A lot of us in the run-up to this war listened to what American and British intelligence were telling us and just thought, really? Oh, come on. I mean, really? It's just not the Putin we know. And it turned out, I mean, I personally felt when it finally happened, I thought, well, you know what? The people who got this right were the war nerds, right? The Michael Kaufmans of this world, the people who kind of count tanks and look where they are and said, no, this looks like the real deal. And then there were people like you and me sitting there going, well, no, I mean, look, this is just not the Putin we know. He's clever. Look, he's got the West where they want. They're running to Moscow to talk to him. They're finally taking him seriously. He's got what he wants. Of course, to have a war now would throw it all away, but he did, which means we're completely wrong. So why?
Well, you and I are reporters. I mean, we're not analysts in the sense that we don't have theories. We actually just go with what people are telling us and are reporting and are well-informed sources. So, I mean, I don't want to be defensive about this because I was certainly wrong. That's definitely true. I said that Putin was not going to do it. But on the other hand, certainly in my defense, a very large section of the senior Kremlin people also believed, and in fact, I mean, as I say in my book Overreach, there's I quote a source who had lunch with Dmitry Peskov, Putin's press secretary, on the first Monday of the war, and this person has known Putin for 20 years, like a close personal inside friend of Putin's, inside of Putin's, and Peskov told this person that at that fateful Security Council meeting on February 21st, where Putin sort of madly berates and browbeats his security establishment, there were only 4 people, according to Peskov, in the room at that moment that were aware of the full plan to decapitate Kiev. They knew that war was afoot. There were the Donbass. There was the whole thing was about are we going to just liberate the rebel republics? Are we going to go further than the borders and so on? And that was what most of those people were the most senior inside advisors, and according to Peskov, even they were not appraised of the full war strategy. So,
did you get the names of the 4?
Yeah, of course. It's Putin, Shoigu, Patrushev, Bortnikov. And Naryshkin's plus Putin. So 4 apart from Putin. Naryshkin being the foreign intelligence chief. So the point is that. It was actually a very closely held secret, or the full scale of the extent of the war was a closely held secret from within the Kremlin itself. But my reasons for believing my sources to be on the money about there not being a war, a full-scale invasion, were probably rather the same as yours. But I mean, because I was actually physically in Moscow when the invasion happened, and there was no preparation. I mean, this is my sort of big thing, is that there was bizarrely no build-up and no preparation. And among the sources that I was speaking to were people like Alexei Venediktov and senior editors of Russian state television channels. And I thought, and one of whom is one of my sort of protagonists of my book under a pseudonym. But I assume that if the Kremlin is preparing a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there would be some kind of sort of propaganda build-up that would somehow sort of pave the way to this. And it didn't happen. I mean, literally, even sort of 48 hours before it happened, no senior editor of any state-controlled Russian media knew a thing about it, which is remarkable, in fact, and it's very strange. And the reason why, I think, actually, in retrospect, is because they thought it was going to be over for 3 days. It's the same reason why they gave their troops 3 days rations. They thought it was going to be like an aggregated military coup, more than an invasion. They thought that it was all going to be over by the shouting very quickly, and they would decapitate the Zelensky regime. But anyway, no, you're right. I was completely mistaken, and I think perhaps overestimated Putin's rationality, which is your key point. Is like suddenly, Putin rolled the dice. But I think it leads to a sort of bigger question, and that is, what happened to Putin, the great strategic genius? And actually, I think if you unpack his actions in Syria, in Crimea, in Georgia, actually, what you realize is that he wasn't smart. He was just very lucky. He was very fortunate. He every play that he made, went right. So he just had a consistent. He was like the luckiest statesman in the world. In his intervention in Syria happened, was enormously significant with one squadron of airplanes, by the way, like 36 planes, like tiny military force, 2,000 people on the ground, totally changed the war because that, if you bring a gun to a knife fight, you win it because you've got your Sukhoi 24s and they have, Kalashnikovs, bang. He changed the tide of the war, but only because America was not interested in getting involved. Same with Crimea. I mean, he occupied Crimea, but actually, because Kiev was in chaos, the West was divided. They were still addicted to Russian gas. They signed Nord Stream 2 deal a year later. All of his calculations come right, and then suddenly he makes it's like a gambler. The stakes just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and he just thinks that he keeps playing black, and black is coming up, and then suddenly, like bang, it's red, and your gamble has not paid off, and you've just lost more than you've ever gained in all of your previous gambles.
Do you think, considering that, considering, okay, Putin just didn't tell anybody, and that's why we all genuinely, for very good reasons. I mean, you mentioned the fact there was no preparation on state TV. We all noticed that. We were all going like, well, they would be talking about Ukrainian Nazis and having documentaries on Channel 1 about...
They kind of were as well.
But for years. But not. There was nothing that said like, hold on, they're preparing the public for this. So the signs weren't there. But, I mean, do you think this... It's what do the Americans say, a teachable moment. I mean, a moment for people like us who've kind of made careers with Russia to remember that a lot of what we do is tea leaf reading, and that we did kind of fail. I mean, we failed for good reasons, I think, but there is. So one of the things that I always find myself coming back to when people ask me about what it's like covering the war at the front is that generally, to be absolutely honest with you, and it sounds like a failure because my job is to tell you what's going on, I just have no idea what's going on. Something went bang over there. I've no idea. Everybody's frightened.
Don't tell them that, really.
Don't tell them that. But that's the reality, all right? It's incredibly difficult to know what's going on in a war. It also seems to me that the past... how many months is it now? 9 months, 8 months? I'm deeply shook my kind of confidence in my sense that I don't know what's going on in the Kremlin. It's a closed box, the presidential administration, but I have a sense of them. I have a sense of what they want and where they're going and their character and stuff like that. Deeply shook my confidence in that. Do you think there's a need for a wider kind of a bit of self-reflection on the part of the Russian watching community?
Well, I think that's a good point, Roland, because the point is that the issue is really how can you predict the actions of a regime that is run by a very tiny group of people, and that the answer is, and one of the things that I found actually surprisingly easy when I was writing the book, like surprisingly abundant, was actually those people do speak to the press. So what you can do when you read the interviews, like sort of loony conspiracy theories and crazy interviews of Nikolai Patrushev, by the way, like he doesn't hold back. Like we know very clearly, how sort of paranoid and crazy these people are. So actually, so bizarrely, like why did we imagine that they wouldn't invade Ukraine, given how bonkers their statements are and how profoundly paranoid they are, and how both Patrushev and Bortnikov and Putin himself are all, by the way, it's very important to emphasize this, they were convinced, they went to war. They believe this is a defensive war against NATO aggression. And Viktor Zolotov, the head of the National Guard, former Putin bodyguard, very powerful Silovik, one of the men of power that surrounds Putin, told NXT Benedictov a couple of years ago, Ukraine does not exist. Ukraine is Russia's border with the US. So those are the terms in which we think. And we sort of knew that. But I guess... and of course, clearly, General Mark Milley, as we know from the Washington Post, brilliant reporting, his warnings were back in October of 2021 in the White House briefing room, personally to Joe Biden. His warnings were absolutely on the money. The CIA, Bill Burns, actually just nailed it. And we will never know. We're going to have to wait for sort of Bob Woodward to come along in a couple of years to tell us what the inside track was in Washington and where they got their information from. But I mean, my understanding was that actually it was not just one sort of single deep throat source. It was actually a multiplicity of sources at different levels. The Ukrainians, by the way, have an interesting theory that actually some of the operational intelligence was in fact leaked to the Americans by Ukrainian security officials that had been bribed by the Russians and briefed on the invasion plans, and then turned coat a second time. Anyway, that's a story that we can't really report out at this moment in time. But it's really true that the Americans had nailed it. But there's one really important distinction, and that is when we go back to the Ukrainians. When you and I have both spoken to various, Zelensky's advisors, and I'm sure we both asked them the same question as I did. It's like, who knew what? Like, what point did you actually think this is going to happen? And they said a really significant thing. I mean, apropos of our debate and the teachable moment and so on. And actually, it goes right back to the Mark Milley briefing. What he's briefing the president about is that Russia has a plan and is preparing an invasion. So they're preparing a feasible invasion, but we don't actually know whether they're going to do it. That's the difference, and that's what the Ukrainians were worried about. Like, they had no doubt that Putin could do it. They had no doubt that Putin was ready to do it operationally, and these obviously build-ups were insanely menacing and obvious and totally dangerous. The one point that they didn't actually know for sure, right up to the very beginning of the war, was was Putin going to press the button on this? Because in fact, there's an entirely plausible situation, as you alluded to earlier, is that actually the only way that Putin could get anyone's attention was by taking this right to the very brink,
and it was working
because he'd been ignored so many times, including the spring of that year. He said and now we're mobilizing 180,000 people, and the West has said oh yeah, whatever, we sorry Vlad, we don't believe you, and then he does it again, and they still don't believe him. So actually, it's not irrational for Putin to actually see okay, now I'm going to really scare the willies out of you, and actually really do it, and maybe occupy just occupy the rebel republics of Donbass and so on. But the actual final step, it was not clear to the Ukrainians, including to Zelensky himself, on the day that the Russian troops occupied those rebel republics, that he had a Security Council meeting with his top advisors, and according to the people I've spoken to, the same people that you've spoken to, that meeting was really inconclusive. Despite the fact that the Ukrainians had all that American information, very detailed, they had their own information, they had their own spies inside Russia and so on. On the day, on 23rd of February, when Russian troops are already in the rebel republics, the Ukrainians themselves did not know whether they're going to advance further. And Zelensky that very evening made an incredibly moving speech to the Russians in his native Russian, appealing to them, saying you realize that you're on the brink of war, let's not do this. So Zelensky clearly believed that actually Putin, until the very last moment, would actually not do it.
Thank you so much, Owen. We're starting to run out of time, I'm afraid. Time has gone by so fast. Thank you so much. I've just got one more question. I want you to take you back to something you said quite early on about the potential military future of this war. And I just wanted to put to you, I wonder if, considering what we've seen over the past 7 months with the successful defence of Kyiv, the sweeping counteroffensive in Kharkiv, one of the most astonishing counterattacks in modern military history, and now today the capture of Kherson. I mean, we're getting all this, as Roland is saying, the social media feeds are lighting up. I mean, right now looking at an astonishing video of crowds of Ukrainians waving Ukrainian flags in the centre of Kherson, opposite the administrative buildings. What you said about how potentially going south, looking at Crimea, that's very difficult. That's not possible. Every single obstacle, or the vast majority that have been put in the way of the Ukrainian armed forces, they have overcome in the past 7-8 months. I wonder. Do you think we still underestimate them or not?
Well, obstacles. They haven't crossed the river yet.
They crossed the Oskil. I was there.
The Oskur?
The Oskil is where they tried to bring it. No one's crossed the Dnieper is the Dnieper. This is a different thing. But the Russians tried to put a defensive line along the Oskil River following the Kharkiv offensive, and the Ukrainians just swept them across.
Okay,
that's a smaller river, considerably smaller.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think the Ukrainians have been significantly underestimated. But I think we also know that they're clearly a better led, better equipped, more motivated army. That's all true. The problem is that, as Adam Smith said, there's a lot of ruin in the nation. However great the Ukrainians may be, and however operationally proficient they may be, the Russians just have that manpower and those supplies of dumb weapons and the artillery and so on, and they can just they're ultimately, I think it's not unrealistic if the Ukrainians had infinite access to Western resources and Western arms, they could probably beat the Russians back. The question is, what's going to be the price of that, and the political question is actually going to become, when they approach Donbass, there are areas of post-1991 Ukraine that actually do not wish to be Ukrainian. I mean, clearly the annexation of Crimea was outrageous and egregious, and was terribly was terribly illegal. But the fact is that the Crimeans didn't really want to be Ukrainians, and they actually did want to be Russians. So once you raise that possibility, then for instance, Crimea being legitimately not part of Ukraine, then you open a gigantic can of worms for the Ukrainians, because you're actually then talking about where you can actually redraw the border reasonably. Because the alternative to that is you're asking for Ukrainian blood and NATO treasure to actually fight and compel parts of Ukraine to rejoin a country of which they do not wish to be a part. I mean, speaking specifically of the rebel republics of the Donbass. I mean, I was there. They really don't want to be Ukrainian. It's despite the international borders. So that question is going to arise, and that's going to be the critical debate over the end game of this war politically. And unfortunately, the real problem is that any kind of surrender of territory is going to be totally politically unsurvivable, not just for Zelensky, but for anybody. That's going to be that's an absolute crisis. And I fear that whatever the outcome of the war is, the Ukrainians will, or a large section of Ukrainians will claim to have been, will feel that they've been betrayed by the West.
Thank you very much, Owen. Roland and Francis, anything to add before we move to your final thoughts?
I do think that Owen's got a point about sentiment in Crimea in particular, and in the so-called rebel republics that were established in 2014, probably simply because in those areas the situation was much more ambivalent, and lots of people have left. Those who were kind of pro-Ukrainian have left over the years. But I think the two cases are quite distinct. I think in terms of population sentiment in Crimea, absolutely, you're going to run into people who genuinely want to be Russian. Quite different to the areas we've seen liberated before. I'm not quite so sure about the republics in Donbass, partly because it's been such a black box, partly because, in my experience, the people in Donbass just desperately want to be left alone, and they're one of the problems that Igor Strelkov-Gherkin, the Russian insurgent leader in the beginning of the war, found there was rallying enough men, finding enough locals to pick up arms to fight for him. I'm not expecting that when the Ukrainians, if they surround and enter Donetsk itself, they're going to be greeted with flowers. I do wonder whether there would be the sentiment for insurgency, or whether people would just crack on with their lives. But interestingly, also just on the Donbass thing, in my conversations in Kiev, that's one of the things that's come up as the kind of the theory going around in their heads in Kiev, that it would be the loss of the city of Donetsk or of Luhansk which might provoke the crisis in Russia, and tell people in Moscow, like, we have lost bad, we've lost big, what the hell is going on, that might trigger it.
If they lose Mariupol, that's pretty painful.
They would talk specifically about Donetsk. I can imagine why Donetsk. It's that just repeating what I was told. Those were the kind of thoughts in their heads. That's the only thing I'd like to add. We could continue this conversation for a very long time, but I know we're running out of time.
We are. Thank you, Roland, and thank you, Owen. Francis, can I come to you for your final thoughts?
Sure. Well, we've covered so much today, and something just struck me when we talked about the First World War earlier, and of course other themes as well, the nature of democracy, what people are willing to fight and die for. And I'm just going to put my head above the parapet, if people excuse the pun, really, and talk about how in Britain here it's Armistice Day, when people pause to remember our war dead. It's marked with a 2-minute silence at 11 o'clock every 11th of November, the moment when World War I ended in 1918. Of course, that poetic timing, 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month, was specifically chosen to mark what was supposed to be a full stop in human history, the war to end all wars. It wasn't, of course, and one often hears people say as a consequence that war is inevitable, that however egregious the horrors of human history, we're doomed to repeat ourselves as a species. However, I just think we should remember that there is a view that that's a very oversimplistic take, and one that I would probably agree with, that ultimately in the 20th century, certain lessons were learnt by millions of people, namely that democracy, the rule of law, and self-determination are worth fighting for, not because they're culturally superior, but for pragmatic reasons. Throughout history, it's much rarer for a democracy to declare war on another democracy than it is for a democracy to fight a dictatorship. Indeed, it's almost always the case that a dictator or an autocracy will launch an invasion for their own self-aggrandizement. So, the spread of democracy, not by force, but by persuasion through the experience of history, recognising its advantages for peace, stability, human flourishing, all of those things, is one of the most remarkable but forgotten things about the 20th century, I would argue. And many people would think now that those principles are at stake in Ukraine, for right or wrong. So for all of the cynicism that's so common at the moment, I just think it's important to remember that war is not inevitable. The relative peace that we've seen in the last 7 decades was hard-earned and sustained through sacrifice and the proliferation of democracy and freedom. And if we want that to be enshrined for another 70 years, I would suggest that we remember that in the difficult months and possibly years ahead.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast by The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can also listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, do leave a review, as it helps others find the show. To our listeners on YouTube, for reasons beyond our control, there's sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you do want to hear an episode as soon as possible, it's available on your podcast apps. Please search for Ukraine the Latest on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred app, and check out the Ukraine page on the Telegraph website. As ever, you can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear. and today on Twitter, Gemma Farrell.